served the dark will of Persian kings for 500 years. Eyes as dark as night, teeth filed to fangs, soulless. The personal guard to King Xerxes himself, the Persian warrior elite. The deadliest fighting force in all of Asia. The Immortals. The God King has betrayed a fatal flaw. Hubris. Easy to taunt, easy to trick. 4 wounds and weariness have taken their toll. The Mad King throws the best he has at us. Xerxes has taken the bait.
Spartans, push!
Immortals. We put their name to the test.
Mortgage is a loan that allows people to buy a house up front. A subprime mortgage is normally issued to borrowers with low credit ratings. And historically, many banks wouldn't even make loans to people with bad credit. In the early 2000s, however, the housing market was booming, so banks began giving subprime mortgages to people even if they had low credit ratings. In other words, lenders, often banks, were loaning money to people who were less likely to be able to pay them back, and charging them more money for those mortgage loans through high interest rates. But many people took on these subprime mortgages because they stood to make a large profit if their house increased in value. And that seemed like a pretty good bet. Houses had been increasing in value over the past several years. Home ownership had always been central to the American dream, and people who may never have imagined they could own a home saw the possibility in front of them. In 2007, the housing bubble burst. As demand went down, the prices of homes dropped rapidly. People stopped investing in real estate since it was no longer as profitable. Many people were no longer able to pay off their mortgages or sell their houses, and the banks foreclosed their homes. Since the foreclosed houses were now worth less money, financial institutions lost money too, along with the homeowners. As a result, the housing market failed. Banks collapsed, the economy plummeted, and the Great Recession had officially begun.
Our eyes bear witness to the grotesque spectacle coughed forth from the darkest corner of Xerxes' empire. When muscle failed, they turned to their magic. 100 nations descend upon us. The armies of all Asia, funneled into this narrow corridor, and numbers count for nothing. They fall by the hundreds. We send the severed bodies and the fragile hearts back to Xerxes' feet.
The economic downturn was devastating. Many people and businesses suffered huge financial losses and therefore spent less money, further damaging the economy. Financial firms were not as capable of lending money, and in 2008, the US government finally had to step in and bail out the banks, increasing the national deficit. Bailouts, federal aid to the auto industry, and government spending programs helped avoid an even bigger crisis.
I won't let banks and lenders off the hook when it was their greed and irresponsibility that partially got us into this mess. We should not be bailing out just Wall Street. We should be restoring opportunity on Main Street.
It was a bum deal for people. You got folks out there, teachers and construction workers and small business people, single moms, and they're working hard. They're acting responsibly. To the extent that they were involved in any of this, it's that some mortgage broker tells them they can afford a house that they don't know. It looks like they can afford it, and suddenly folks are getting wiped out.
The villagers! I found them.
Have the gods no mercy? We are doomed. Quiet yourself.
The child speaks of the Persian ghosts, known from the ancient times. They are the hunters of men's souls. They cannot be killed or defeated. Not this darkness.
It's difficult to define the exact cause of the 2008 crisis, but the collapse of the American housing market was one of the greatest factors. It started a chain reaction that led to the bankruptcy of the Lehman Brothers firm and soon had a crippling effect on the American and European economies. But what happened? In the early 2000s, interest rates were so low that many Americans borrowed money to buy houses, causing house prices to increase rapidly. This episode is known as the US housing bubble and lasted until early 2006, when house prices peaked. The burst of that bubble is considered one of the main causes of the Great Recession. It started as a crisis in the subprime mortgage market and snowballed into a global collapse. The world economy experienced plummeting house prices and a sharp increase in unemployment rates.
Commissioner, Mr. President, I rise again, I'm afraid, to make the same old hoary speech that I've been making here for several years, and that is, it is my opinion that you do not really understand the concept of banking. All the banks are broke. Bank Santander, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, they're all broke. And why are they broke? It isn't an act of God. It isn't some sort of tsunami. They're broke because we have a system called fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can lend money that they don't actually have. It's a criminal scandal, and it's been going on for too long. To add to that problem, you have moral hazard, a very significant moral hazard from the political sphere. And most of the problem starts in politics and central banks, which are part of the same political system. We have counterfeiting, sometimes called quantitative easing, but counterfeiting by any other name. The artificial printing of money, which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time. And yet governments and central banks do it all the time. Central banks repress the amount of interest that rates are, so we don't have the real cost of money, and yet we blame the real retail banks for manipulating LIBOR. The sheer effrontery of this is quite astonishing. It's central banks that manipulate interest rates, Commissioner. And plus, underneath all this, we talk loosely, in a rather cavalier fashion, do we not, about deposit guarantees. So when banks go broke through their own incompetence and chicanery, the taxpayer picks up the tab. It's theft from the taxpayer. And until we start sending bankers, and I include central bankers and politicians, to prison for this outrage, it will continue.
This is where we hold them. This is where we fight. This is where they die. And these shields, boys! Remember this day, men, for it will be yours for all time.
The technology likely to have the greatest impact on the next few decades has arrived. And it's not social media, it's not big data, it's not robotics, it's not even AI. And you'll be surprised to learn that it's the underlying technology of digital currencies like Bitcoin. It's called the blockchain. Blockchain. Now, it's not the most sonorous word in the world, but I believe that this is now the next generation of the internet, and that it holds vast promise for every business, every society, and for all of you individually. You know, for the past few decades, we've had the Internet of Information. And when I send you an email or a PowerPoint file or something, I'm actually not sending you the original, I'm sending you a copy. And that's great. This is democratized information. But when it comes to assets, things like money, financial assets like stocks and bonds, loyalty points, intellectual property, music, art, a vote, carbon credit, and other assets, sending you a copy is a really bad idea. If I send you $100, it's really important that I don't still have the money and that I can't send it to you. So this has been called the double spend problem by cryptographers for a long time. So today, we rely entirely on big intermediaries, middlemen like banks, government, big social media companies, credit card companies, and so on, to establish trust in our economy. And these intermediaries perform all the business and transaction logic of every kind of commerce, from authentication, identification of people, through to clearing, settling, and record keeping. And overall, they do a pretty good job, but there are growing problems. To begin, they're centralized. That means that they can be hacked, and increasingly are. And JP Morgan, the US federal government, LinkedIn, Home Depot, and others found that out the hard way. They exclude billions of people from the global economy. For example, people who don't have enough money to have a bank account. They slow things down. It can take a second for an email to go around the world, but it can take days or weeks for money to move through the banking system across the city. And they take a big piece of the action, 10 to 20%, just to send money to another country. They capture our data, and that means that we can't monetize it or use it to better manage our lives. And our privacy is being undermined. And the biggest problem is that overall, they've appropriated the largesse of the digital age asymmetrically. And we have wealth creation, but we have growing social inequality. So what if there were not only an internet of information, what if there were an internet of value? Some kind of vast, global, distributed ledger running on millions of computers and available to everybody, and where every kind of asset, from money to music, could be stored, moved, transacted, exchanged, and managed, all without powerful intermediaries. What if there were a native medium for value? Well, in 2008, the financial industry crashed, and perhaps propitiously, an unknown or anonymous person or persons named Satoshi Nakamoto created a paper where he developed a protocol for a digital cash that used an underlying cryptocurrency called Bitcoin. And this cryptocurrency enabled people to establish trust and do transactions without a third party. And the seemingly simple act set off a spark that's ignited the world, that has everyone excited or terrified or otherwise interested in many places. Now, don't be confused about Bitcoin, okay? Bitcoin is an asset. It goes up and down, and that should be of interest to you if you're a speculator. More broadly, it's a cryptocurrency. It's not a fiat currency controlled by a nation state, and that's of greater interest. But the real pony here is the underlying technology. It's called blockchain. So For the first time now in human history, people everywhere can trust each other and transact peer-to-peer. And trust is established not by some big institution, but by collaboration, by cryptography, and by some clever code. And because trust is native to the technology, I call this the trust protocol. Now you're probably wondering, well, how does this thing work? Fair enough. Assets, digital assets like money to music and everything in between, are not stored in a central place, but they're distributed across a global ledger using the highest level of cryptography. And when a transaction is conducted, it's posted globally across millions and millions of computers. And out there around the world is a group of people called miners. These are not young people, they're Bitcoin miners. And they have massive computing power at their fingertips, 10 to 100 times bigger than all of Google worldwide. And these miners do a lot of work. And every 10 minutes, kind of like the heartbeat of a network, a block gets created that has all the transactions from the previous 10 minutes. And then the miners get to work trying to solve some tough problems. And they compete. And the first miner to find out the truth and to validate the block is rewarded in digital currency, in the case of the Bitcoin blockchain with Bitcoin. And then, this is the key part, that block is linked to the previous block and the previous block to create a chain of blocks, and everyone is time-stamped, kind of like with a digital wax seal. So if I wanted to go and hack a block and say, pay you and you with the same money, I'd have to hack that block, plus all the preceding blocks, the entire history of commerce, on that blockchain, not just on one computer, but across millions of computers simultaneously, all using the highest levels of encryption in the light of the most powerful computing resource in the world that's watching me. Tough to do. And this is infinitely more secure than the computer systems that we have today. Blockchain, that's how it works. To understand what a radical change this is going to bring, let's look at one industry, financial services. Recognize this? Rube Goldberg machine. It's a ridiculously complicated machine that does something really simple, like crack an egg or shut a door. Well, kind of reminds me of the financial services industry, honestly. I mean, you tap your card in the corner store and a bit stream goes through a dozen companies, and each with their own computer systems, some of them being 1970s mainframes, older than many of the people in this room. And 3 days later, a settlement occurs. Well, with a blockchain financial industry, there would be no settlement because the payment and the settlement is the same activity. It's just a change in the ledger. So Wall Street and all around the world, the financial industry is in a big upheaval about this, wondering, can we be replaced, or how do we embrace this technology for success?
As a small business, you rely on your bank to manage deposits, bills, loans, and so much more. And if you're like most small businesses, you also rely on your bank to process wire transfers to pay workers, suppliers, or manufacturers overseas. But in this case, it's a reliance that's hurting both your business relationships and bottom line. That's because banks normally use SWIFT to process these transactions. Created in the early 1970s and showing its age, SWIFT enables wire transfers via a global network of intermediary banks. Using SWIFT is costly, and, despite its name, the process is anything but speedy. First, you're required to manually input the receiver's banking details. Then, you select their currency, which triggers a foreign exchange rate that's typically 4 to 6% above the actual rate. Once the transfer is initiated, your funds get routed through multiple intermediary banks, costing you more time and money, while putting transfers at risk of being lost or delayed.
now. Brad Garlinghouse is the CEO of the cryptocurrency developer Ripple. Ripple's XRP token has surged more than 500% this year. Brad, nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, just tell people what exactly Ripple does, because it's not just the currency, also you're very involved in blockchain.
Absolutely. So Ripple sells a blockchain technology to banks and payment providers and other financial institutions to do real-time settlement between banks. So today, if Morgan wanted to send $10,000 to London right now, the fastest way for her to do that is to drive to Newark or JFK and fly it there. Our view is, in a world of the internet, you can stream video from the space station. You should be able to do real-time settlement between banks, and we sell technology to banks to do that.
And the banks are getting on board with this because I know there's a lot of paper pushing and also a lot of money attached to those settlements.
For sure. So we have over 100 banks working with Ripple today around the world. I think the vast majority of banks, like 99.9% of banks, actually are paying other banks, the kind of the global money center banks like JP Morgan or Citibank, to make those settlements. So a lot of the banks are very excited about democratizing how these global payments flow.
There's a belief that, you could transform the global payment system over time. Although then the alternative argument is you need a centralized. You can't have it decentralized, that it actually benefits from efficiencies. I would assume you come down on the left.
Yeah, for sure. I think anytime you can do something without that central counterparty, you're going to reduce friction, which is measured by time, cost, speed. So by removing that central counterparty and going direct from point to point, you can skip going from the Bank of David to the Bank of Morgan to the Bank of Mike. You just go directly to the Bank of Mike.
So if the immediate opportunity is efficiencies in this area of the actual kind of nuts and bolts sort of plumbing of the financial system, how does that relate to the value of the Ripple tokens or of the Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies? They're taking on a separate life, it seems, from the future of adoption of this technology.
It's a great point, and I think one of the things we all have to remember is that the value of a token over the long term is really going to be derived by its utility. What problem is it solving? How big is that problem? How many customers do you have? There's no question there's a lot of hype in this system, and I don't actually think that's a good thing. For Ripple, we use this digital asset called XRP to settle liquidity needs between banks. So today there's $27 trillion parked at different banks around the world so they can make payments between each other. Our view is you can use a digital asset like XRP to do that in real time. Because XRP has been so efficient, it settles a transaction in about 3 seconds compared to Bitcoin.
So it just passes through that currency for that period of time.
That's correct.
Yeah.
It does look like rain.
Zeus stabs the sky with thunderbolts and batters the Persian ships with hurricane wind. Glorious. Only one among us keeps his Spartan reserve. Only he. Only our king.